I wonder if you could just talk about what sort of revisions you expect to happen at the time of submission, given that there are going to be more revisions later on.
Yeah, I'll say a couple words about that. It's important to think about dissertations as a sort of pre-book format or a sort of not yet book format. The fact is, as a document, a dissertation is doing something very different than a book. You know, your dissertation is proving your worthiness for the PhD, and it's demonstrating your ability to do research. You know, this is not to say that all dissertations in their raw form are necessarily that far from a book manuscript, but for the most part, they do need a considerable amount of work before they're approaching a book manuscript. So one of the most common, I'll just outline a couple of the most common aspects. One is the absence of a strong through line or narrative, you know, that the dissertation is not necessarily telling a story, you know, and some of that can have to do with the way a dissertation was crafted. In some cases, you know, you've written 2 or 3 really great chapters, really strong articles, and you're looking for some kind of overarching theme to pull them together into the dissertation, you know, and that doesn't say anything about the quality of the scholarship. You know, each of those smaller pieces might be very, very solid scholarship that you can publish in journals, you know, quite easily with minimal amount of revisions. But in terms of a book, telling one research story, if you think of it that way, research narrative, research question, overarching nice through line that carries the reader through each chapter with some kind of coherence, that might not necessarily be the case with it in a given dissertation. There also tend to be some writing quirks. Dissertations tend to have a lot of repetition. Because you're acting to prove your research ability, there's a lot of listing, there's a lot of block quotes, there's a lot of repetition of various examples to prove that you know that they exist. In a book format, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can summarize that work very generally. Your authority is taken for granted to a certain degree because you've already proven your worthiness for the degree. So those are the kinds of differences between a dissertation and a book, you know, that are the most obvious. You know, there's smaller things too. I say smaller, hopefully smaller. The question of length. You know, a dissertation can be quite weighty. And some of it has to do with this issue of research, proving the thoroughness of the research that doesn't necessarily have to be executed in a book in exactly the same way. So, you know, suitability of length for the market, and I mean, even for scholarly books, that's something that we have to take into account. You know, we want to sell the book, and if we can find a wider audience outside of libraries and the scholars in your field, we're always looking to do that. So we're going to look at potential markets and try to assess length that way. Questions of readability in terms of referencing. Footnotes, notes are a major issue sometimes with dissertations. I always think of Foucault's dissertation, for example, has just finally been published in, I think just published in French. And one of the stumbling blocks on that was the fact that the thing was like 1/3 notes. You know, ridiculous. Pages and pages and pages and pages of notes. And in terms of through line, that's highly disruptive. And I'm sure you've had this experience yourself where you're constantly paging back and forth between the endnotes. And for a dissertation, that's fine, but that's not something that you necessarily want, even, you know, coming as a scholarly reader to a work, you know, can be very disruptive in terms of following particular arguments. So these are the kinds of things. There are some great guides actually out on the market to revising your dissertation. One of them is from the University of Chicago Press by William Germano. It's called From Dissertation to Book. There's another one from the University of Toronto Press called From Thesis to Book.
The thesis in the book.
The thesis in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And both of them are very, you know, have had recent updates. They're very up to date, and they're quick and dirty. They're only about 130, 140 pages each. Packed full of useful information in terms of approaching your dissertation. You know, it's important to ask yourself at that stage, you know, what you need in terms of your career. You know, and this comes back to this question, you know, approaching the dissertation. Sometimes it's better to just mine those good articles. Sometimes it's obvious that there's a nice solid book project there. And to be really honest with yourself and not, you know, to evaluate what's best for your project, what's best for your research. You know, not every dissertation is suited to be revised into a book.
And also just as a further to that, just your energy level for dealing with
gosh.
the project. You know, if it's been
Yeah.
a dissertation that you've worked on forever, you have to be able to be willing to still tackle it and repurpose it and so on. So that's something to consider too.